Hello, my name is Nick Northrup, and welcome to In the Nick of Time on Lamar University Television. I'm a student in the Department of Communication and Media who's been interested in history for as long as I can remember. And everyone knows at least a little bit about history. Bits and pieces like George Washington was the first president of the United States, or Rome wasn't built in a day. But not nearly as many people know the depth of our world's lore. From the strange circumstances that allowed Pepsi to own the sixth largest navy in the world, to the important things like the foundation of the number system that we use today. On In the Nick of Time, I'm hoping to broaden your horizons, teach you a bit about the real stories of the past, and explain why they are relevant today. In this episode, we will start with the foundations, historiography, or simply put, the history of history. Why did we start recording things? When did we start recording things? How reliable can ancient history be? Is history truly only written by the victors? Up next, I am bringing in a professional to answer these questions and more. Make sure to stay with us.
Multiple studies have shown that marijuana can slow both driver reaction and response time, which can be really dangerous. He's here. He's here.
Wait.
What?
I can't drive.
Why?
My.
Oh.
There's so many rewards in life. You coming into our home was one of the greatest rewards we could have ever had.
You know, it took 20 years, and I got my third child, who was 17 at the time.
It's so cool to watch the adult that you've become, and you really have done as much for us as you think we've done for you.
Welcome back to In the Nick of Time. I'm here at the LUTV News Desk with Dr. Rebecca Boone of Lamar University. So, first, who are you?
Well, I am Dr. Rebecca Boone, and I am a professor of history, and I'm chair of the history department, and I'm also chair of university studies.
All right, and how long have you been studying history?
I have been studying history since I was an undergraduate officially, and before that, since I could, and since I was a child, right?
All right, and you first decided to study history in college then?
Yes.
All right, and did you have any passions before then?
Well, I'll tell you a story. The story is that as an undergraduate, I was really just pre-law, but pre-law could be political science, or it could be English, or it could be psychology or history. But I was dating a boy as a freshman, and on our first date, I said, "What is your major?" And he said, "Well, I'm a history major." I've known I was going to be a history major from the time I was a child. And I thought, well, that's interesting. I've never met anybody who felt that way. So we started dating, and then we started taking every single class together. So I started taking history classes and doing very well in them. And I became a history major. And then 2 weeks after we graduated, we got married, and we've been married for 30 years.
I hope to have as romantic of a marriage. That's very nice. So what sort of history do you specialize in?
My specialty is the Renaissance. And I started in Renaissance Italy and France. And now I do the global world from 1500 to 1750.
Wow. I also heard that you do the history of food.
I do the history of food. I love to teach world history through food, because food is everything. Literally every human ritual, every revolution, everything is based on food. Everything that happens in the world is based on food, and human beings actually are food. So food is foundational if you want to talk about history.
Humans are food. All right, fair enough. To some people.
Well, I mean, on many different levels, right?
Mm-hmm. So you've done some field work. What sort of field work have you done?
Well, in history, field work is basically archival work. So I've been to archives in, I'm going to say, about 5 countries. And this is where you go and you look at manuscripts and you look at reports and you just look at things that are 500 years old. And they just have them all in a big stack in an archive. And if you're a historian, it's the most fun you could ever have.
Yeah, I can't even imagine touching a document, or maybe not touching. I don't know if you touch the
Yeah,
500-year-old documents.
But sometimes you have to wear gloves. And sometimes you have to wear gloves, and sometimes at some archives, people with machine guns are watching you.
Wow.
I'm not quite sure why, but in case anything happens to the documents, some archives want to protect them.
Fair enough. So today we are going to be discussing historiography. Am I pronouncing that right?
Yes, yes.
Historiography. So what exactly is that?
Well, historiography is the study of history. So that's what, when you become a historian, you're not just learning what people did or what happened in the past. You're learning about how people wrote about what happened in the past and why they wrote and what it means.
Okay, so why did people start recording history?
Well, I can tell you that because I actually am I do study historiography, and it seems to be that the first history came out of funeral orations in ancient Greece. So in ancient Greece, when somebody died in the city-states such as Athens or Sparta, you would have a funeral oration for the person, but people would talk about the city and talk about what the person did in the city and how to make the city better. And so that discussion of the city becomes a sort of an encomium of the city, a sort of people express their civic pride through these discussions of the history of the city, through the history of these lives. And eventually that became a celebration of the city. And Herodotus, who is the father of history, he wrote the first history as a celebration of the Greeks in their war against the Persians.
Wow, I have heard of Herodotus. Yeah, he's often called either the first historian or the father of historiography. So was Greece or ancient Greece the first ones to start recording history?
Well, so they're the first ones to call it history because across the world, throughout all of human history, there have been chronicles. People have kept chronicles and have studied them. But what we have in ancient Greece are people who are contesting history, and history becomes a sort of a political thing and a question. So Herodotus, he called his work, he was the first one to use the word history, which means inquiry. This is an inquiry on why something happened the way it happened. And he said, well, obviously we won the Persian War because we were a democracy, and democracies are better than authoritarian governments. But that's not the only reason why you would write history, because the man who came after him is Thucydides. And he wrote a history of the Peloponnesian War. And he did not write the book that would say, oh, Athens is the best, or, the Greeks are the best. He wrote a book about civil war. And he didn't write it to make it seem great. He wrote everything horrible about the Greeks. And this is another reason that people wrote history, and it's a big reason throughout history, and that is to settle scores. He was fired from his job as general for the Athenians and exiled, and he was going to tell the world how bad Athens was and how stupid they were, and that's why they lost the war.
So then it's reasonable to assume that certain historical documents are unreliable.
Oh no, actually, it's very reliable in many ways because he wanted to make it so detailed and so awful that nobody would ever doubt him, And so any historian knows, just like any journalist, anybody interested in critical thinking, all history, all testimony is unreliable. The only thing you can do is get as many witnesses as possible together, and then you go and you synthesize it. So nobody would ever take Thucydides at his word. You have to have other documents, but if they're accurate, I mean, if they all corroborate, it's like a crime scene, essentially. I mean, we're detectives at a crime scene, except the crime was committed a long, long time ago.
And speaking of long time ago, historians often separate history into different eras. Modern, prehistory. What are those eras and what separates them?
Well, traditionally in European history, you have antiquity that lasts until around 500, and then you have the Middle Ages that lasts around up to maybe 1350, 1400, and then you have the Renaissance that lasts until, I would say, 1600, and then you have, I guess, the early modern world until around 1800, and then you have the modern world. I guess that's the way things are now.
Okay, and throughout these different eras, what different ways did people record history?
Well, the interesting thing is that you can see different history recorded different ways, even in the same time. So, for example, in ancient Rome had a republic with a senate, and they kept good records. They kept minutes, they kept records, for 500 years. And then Rome became a monarchy where you had an emperor and no records were kept. And so you didn't have those documents anymore. So even in ancient Rome, what we have is a pretty good history when they kept records, because historians could rely on public documents. But once you had an emperor, you don't have history anymore. You don't have as accurate of history, because you only have court gossip, what people said at the court of the emperor, but it's very unreliable, right? Because most historians have an axe to grind, as usual. So you have chronicles in authoritarian states, for example, chronicles of the history of China, chronicles in the history of Vietnam. You have chronicles in all over the world. But unless you have public documents, it's very hard to have accurate histories the way we practice it today.
All right. And as our last question, what is your favorite era of history, favorite historical tidbit?
Well, my favorite era of history is whatever I'm studying right now.
That is a fair and good answer. Well,
all
right. I do believe that is about it for today. So, after this very short break, we are going to find out the answer to the question, what do pizza, fondue, and the caves beneath Missouri have in common? Thank you for joining us.
If you're buzzed and doing this, to make yourself feel okay to drive,
ZWX.
you're not okay to drive.
YGKLVW. Regular you.
STEM is everywhere. Like here, behind the scenes of The Walking Dead.
When we break down clothes, we tumble it with trisodium phosphate, rock salt, and dish detergent.
We stitched together images of our model and created a 3D set that could be walked through in a VR headset.
We're able to turn 12 walkers into 1,000 walker boards.
STEM can create new worlds on and off the screen. What will you make with STEM? Get inspired at shecanstem.com.
Before the break, I asked, what do pizza, fondue, and the caves beneath Missouri have in common? The answer to this rather odd question is cheese. In the 1970s, the Jimmy Carter administration introduced a plan that was meant to help farmers. It did this by increasing the price of dairy products. But doing such a thing is much easier said than done. Quick question. How do you think the government planned to do this? A. Implement price floors and caps. B. Pay farmers to decrease their production. Or C. Buy as much cheese as possible. If you guessed C, you would be right. Now, why cheese? Why not just get milk? Well, if you've ever bought a gallon and left it in your fridge for a bit too long, there's your answer. Cheese simply takes longer to expire than other dairy products. So, farmers began producing, then selling their milk to cheese producers en masse. And the government began buying cheese en masse from these cheesemakers. Soon, all the fridges and cold stores that the government had access to was filled to the brim with cheese and other dairy products. In schools, libraries, and other government places, you have certainly seen the Got Milk posters or commercials. Advertising campaigns like this were an attempt by the government to further element the demand for dairy. Well, Americans simply could not keep up with the amount of product that farmers were supplying. So they needed an alternative. How can we store a ridiculous amount of cheese? Springfield, Missouri, with a large empty limestone quarry, had the answer. Put that cheese in caves. The government began doing just that with hundreds of millions of pounds of cheese. Over time, the Reagan administration used welfare programs and advertising to eventually distribute this cheese across the country. This odd tradition is still kept up today by private companies, though. Across the nation, more than 1.4 billion pounds of cheese is just sitting and aging, waiting to be used in everything from your family lasagna to Kraft mac and cheese. There's a lot more info to this bizarre case of resource management, so I highly recommend taking some time out of your day to do a bit of research on it. Well, that was it for In the Nick of Time. I hope that I provided you with a sense of curiosity and that you'll be back for the next episode. Until then, remember that every nick of time is a moment that will go down in history.